This is for December the 10th, 2020. This is American history. Well, in the Grant administration, the North is going to go through unprecedented growth. The North had had to supply itself during the Civil War, and this encouraged industrialization. There is a large number of immigrants who will come to the United States in the late 1860s and continue to come throughout the rest of the 19th century. These immigrants will work for very low wages. The Grant administration is generally seen as the beginning of the Gilded Age. The Transcontinental Railroad, which had been begun during the Civil War, was completed in 1869. Grant was asked to come to Utah to drive the ceremonial last spike. This video talks about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Blacks did not fare well in the North. They had hoped that they would be able to succeed because of industrialization, but they could not. In the South, many of the blacks are going to face Jim Crow laws, and they're going to see that their rights are not as great as that of whites. It is because of this that many blacks are going to move to the Great Plains. This is what is called the Exodus movement. The Exodus movement is when blacks will leave the South, blacks will leave the North, and head toward the Great Plains. That is why there are certain parts of Kansas, Nebraska, and the two Dakotas that have heavy concentration of black populations, because these were areas that the blacks landed. Now, blacks were not the only ones, though. Many whites are going to take part in the Homestead Act. Now, the Congress believed that the Great Plains was uninhabitable, that because of its lack of trees, not much could be grown. So the idea was, let's give land away. And then you live on this land for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, if you have made the land productive, you have grown something, you have built a home, then the land is yours. Now, the Homestead Act was given to both whites and blacks. The Civil War, as tragic as it was, could have been even more tragic had it not been for nurses. Now, prior to the Civil War, all nurses in military hospitals were males. But they were so overwhelmed during the Civil War that women began to volunteer. This is Clara Barton. She was from a fairly well-to-do family in Maryland. And after the Battle of Antietam, she accompanied a large number of Union and Confederate wounded back to Washington. There, she cared for them. Other women read about what Clara Barton was doing, and soon Clara Barton was inundated with other women wanting to be like her. Soon Clara Barton began a school for nursing. Several of the new states that are formed during this time period will allow women the right to vote. Wyoming was the first state to allow women the right to vote. Now, they couldn't vote in federal elections, but they could vote in state elections. Wyoming was one of the first states to have a woman governor. Now, a couple of these slides are going to be brand new from the packet that you originally received. Radical Republicans and President Grant are going to work to protect the newly franchised black men of the South. This here is a poster. The gentleman in the middle is Frederick Douglass, a black orator of the day. The gentleman on the left side is Hiram Revels. He was the first United States Senator from the state of Mississippi who was black. Southern whites did not think that Southern whites did all they could to keep the blacks from voting. We hear about the KKK. In the state of Arkansas, hundreds of blacks will be killed. in the state of Louisiana. An even greater total of thousands of blacks will be killed. Soon, these states are beginning to be dominated by white Democrats. In 1873, a panic is going to sweep through the country, and Congress felt it had to do something to protect Northern industry. To use a metaphor from sports, we would say that Congress took its eye off the ball, and blacks began to lose political power. In 1872, it is a presidential election year, and Grant is still as popular in 72 as he had been in 68. Grant announced that he will seek a second term. To oppose Grant, the Democratic convention is torn. Most of the delegates are interested in Horace Greeley, who is another newspaper editor from New York. But there are other Democrats who begin to break off and nominate this person or nominate that person. If you look at the map here, you will notice that Grant is in blue. But notice all of the southern states that have multiple colors. These are states that electors went not for one guy, but for two or three. Greeley only received a very small number of votes from Georgia. Again, please notice that most of the South, most of the Confederate South, has voted Republican simply because there are so few left of the white community to vote who have not been disenfranchised. I have said that a panic swept across this country in 1873. The panic was brought on by Jay Cooke. If you remember, we put Jay Cooke in our notes in the last lesson. Jay Cooke had sold bonds. Now, for every bond he sold, Jay Cooke got a small amount of money. Jay Cooke is going to take this money and he's going to buy the Northern Railroad Company. Now, the Northern Railroad Company is just one of many railroad companies. And the Northern Railroad Company is going to go bust along with other railroad companies, and this will trigger bankruptcies in Eastern banks. Soon, a panic has developed. Now, the panic was basically caused by borrowed money and the inability to pay it off. Cooke had made his money during the Civil War. It was Cooke who had created the greenback system. That is where you print a dollar, but it is not backed by specie. Cooke had used his profits to purchase railroads. By 1873, the United States was inundated by railroads, and the weaker ones collapsed. Newspapers found that they could sell stories about corruption. And there was corruption in business, and there was corruption in government, and soon the corruption is going to touch Grant himself. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the richest man in the world at the end of the American Civil War. Cornelius Vanderbilt is going to be caught in a stock swindle. Now, the stock swindle was created by these two men, Jay Gould and James Fisk. Now, these two gentlemen said that they were financiers. What they did was they printed up counterfeit stocks in Vanderbilt's Central New York Railroad. Then they went and sold the stock, and then printed up some more, and then sold the stock, and soon the Vanderbilt Railroad was practically worthless. This swindle is going to make many people question stocks and the purchase of stocks. This video here talks about the Gould episode. In building the Transcontinental Railroad, corruption was seen in the Credit Mobilier scandal. Now, Credit Mobilier is a financial organization. Now, what Credit Mobilier did was it bought things for the railroad, particularly the Union Pacific out of Omaha. The problem was Credit Mobilier paid more than it should for the products. And the people who had sold the products then gave a kickback to the people who had run Credit Mobilier. Now, this should have been seen in Congress. But Credit Mobilier, to its credit, is going to give away stock in Credit Mobilier to congressmen. One of the congressmen will serve as Ulysses S. Grant's vice president. Soon all of this hit the newspaper, and many congressmen and Grant's vice president are forced to resign. Grant himself was never implicated. The whiskey ring. The whiskey ring occurred in St. Louis. Now, various distillers have to pay excise tax. And so what they would do is they would have a 50-gallon barrel and they would pay excise tax for a 40-gallon barrel. And then they would give the government agents a little bit of money to look the other way. And they could make money off of the sale of whiskey. Well, soon St. Louis newspapers hear about this, and the Treasury Department, which is responsible for the excise tax, is sucked into this scandal. Again, Grant had nothing to do with it, but it made his administration look corrupt. In New York, we have Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is the name of a building, and it is run by Republicans who are under the direction of Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed demands certain contracts, certain appointees to deliver votes for Grant and fellow Republicans. Now remember, back in those days, when you voted, you had to vote out loud, so everybody knew how you voted. And it was easy for Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring to deliver a certain number of votes because they knew the people who voted would not vote against them. In 1876, it is time for a presidential election. Grant's popularity, in spite of the scandals, was as popular as ever. But Grant chose not to run for a third term. And now the Republicans and Democrats will have to come up with a new person. This here is a video that deals with Grant and his 2 terms as president. I think this would be a good place for us to stop. Tomorrow, we are going to look at the 1876 election. Now, as soon as this video is over, there is going to be a walkout worksheet. This one will be graded because everybody who's in class will be doing this one as well. So make sure you do the walkout worksheet. Otherwise, you'll see a missing next to your name.